Just 1 year following the release of Resident Evil 2, Capcom has returned once again with a new Resident Evil game based on a classic installment. Resident Evil 3 builds upon much of what made last year's game great, but makes some significant changes to the formula as well. So the question today is, how does this game stack up to last year's Resident Evil 2, and how does it compare to the original Resident Evil 3 for that matter? And how about the technology? Have things changed since the demo? To discuss all this and more, I've brought along a good friend and Resident Evil aficionado, Alex Aniel.
Hey John, how's it going?
Wonderfully. And I think both of us have been playing Resident Evil 3 over the past few days, and it's been pretty fun overall, I'd say. I've had a nice time playing it, despite some flaws.
Yeah, I've had fun with it. It's definitely an interesting game in a lot of ways.
I thought it was, I guess the first thing is that it is kind of fun how they really did sort of keep the release circumstances sort of a similar way. How the original Resident Evil 3 appeared in, I think it was like mid to late 1999, whereas Resident Evil 2 was in 98, early 98. And obviously the gap is actually even smaller this time, which is kind of remarkable, I think.
Yeah, it's been a really long time since we've had two new Resident Evil games come out this close together. I would actually say if we only look at numbered titles, I think the last time that happened was Resident Evil 3 and, well, this isn't a numbered game, but Resident Evil 3 and Code Veronica came out a few months apart because they were in development at the same time. The other one I can think of would be Remake and Resident Evil 0, which both came out on GameCube in the same year. So it's been quite a while since we've had two full-on Resident Evil games come out so close together. So I'm really glad though. I think it made sense for Capcom to do both of them around the same time rather than, waiting.
Exactly. I mean, so let's talk a little bit of technology here first. So obviously Resident Evil 3 is still utilizing Capcom's in-house RE engine, which I'm a big fan of. They typically, they aim for high frame rates with a lot of fidelity on the characters and environments and the materials. It's a great looking engine. So it does feel like a natural follow-up to what we saw last year with 2. But I guess the first kind of thing to discuss, being that this is Digital Foundry, is the resolution. So we already looked at the demo just a week or so ago. So I guess the question here is whether or not the final game has changed. And I can report that no, it has not changed in this regard. So Ps4 Pro is still 2880 by 1620 using a checkerboard rendering to reach that resolution, while Xbox One X instead targets a native 4K, which is higher than Resident Evil 2, but this has some repercussions that we'll get to later. But then the base consoles, 1080p on the base PS4, and then also 1080p on Xbox One base, with a slight reduction in fidelity during certain cutscenes. In terms of actual visual differences between the various platforms, it remains the same as the demo basically, which Tom pointed out in his video. So Xbox One X gets a slight boost to bokeh depth of field quality, while shadow edges are a little bit cleaner. But really most of it comes down to differences in resolution and pixel breakup on fine objects. It looks good, but if you were hoping for any changes to the demo, they are not really here. It looks exactly the same. But, I guess the main thing is this is still a great looking game, but it's a little bit of a different game in terms of the environments that you explore. So Resident Evil 2 did have a few outdoor sort of city environments, but for the most part it was contained within the police station, in the sewers, and then of course the underground lab, and that was pretty much where you went. Where Resident Evil 3 tries to break away from this a little bit, and it takes you to more areas, though each area in and of itself is less complex than any of the singular spots you visited in Resident Evil 2. How do you feel that works for you in terms of just both the design and just the feel of the game?
Yeah, it's interesting you ask, because Resident Evil 3, even though it takes place at the same time as Resident Evil 2, it's the same setting essentially, but we're supposed to be looking at the city as a whole in Resident Evil 3, whereas in Resident Evil 2 it was a lot more focused in one specific spot. And there is a little bit of intersection between the two games, but I actually thought for a game that's come out in 2020, the city designs were a little disappointing for me. They look great, but I noticed that throughout the game, the cities are very linear. There are a few branching paths, but not too many. And there's always like debris that's been conveniently discarded in locations that force you to take one path throughout the room. And it's like a glorified hallway in a lot of ways. So I really didn't get the feeling that I was in an open box world. And to be fair to Capcom, they weren't actually saying that was the case, but that was kind of one thing I was hoping would have improved over the original. I was hoping that we'd have a little bit more ability to explore through the city streets, but I feel like it's still very restrictive in that sense.
Yeah, I definitely get what you mean. I mean, it does look visually strong most of the time, but it feels more constrained, in fact, than, say, even the police station in Resident Evil 2, in that there really isn't a lot of freedom in terms of where you go. It's just there. You're not backtracking very often. You're not really becoming familiar with it. It's just a place that you cross through to get to the next area. And yeah, so it doesn't really feel like a significant push forward in that regard. But on the visual side, I think the presentation is quite impressive. I think we can agree on that, right?
Yeah, all in all, I think it's actually a fairly noticeable jump over Resident Evil 2 in terms of the facial design and the amount of detail that the textures seem to have. I think overall they seem to have honed in on the technique. So I feel like Resident Evil 3 looks, especially in cutscenes, a lot cleaner, but a lot more detailed as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I guess my only nitpick with the visuals is that they still retain the same implementation for screen space reflections. And those reflections in particular, with the way that the RE engine seems to deliver them, they're very noisy. You might have noticed it even there, like if you just look at like the reflections in the puddles in the streets, there's almost like a persistent like fuzziness or graininess to all the reflections that, you know, it to me it almost looks a little bit distracting. Along those same lines, they also update the animation at a different rate depending on the distance from the camera. Like here, if you look at the zombies and sort of against the fence, you can see them kind of moving at about quarter rate, so it looks really choppy at a distance. If you get closer, then they update it half rate, and then closer still, they update it full rate. It's likely just a performance saving technique, especially on the CPU side, but it does kind of stick out once in a while. I guess what's more interesting to me, though, is when looking at Resident Evil 2 last year, I felt like it really followed the original Resident Evil 2, the 1998 release, relatively closely. Like, obviously, everything was redesigned and improved and modified in some significant ways, but when you actually mapped it out and you went through it, you could see, like, oh yeah, they're trying to do this scene here, this scene there. It felt like a very natural kind of way to revisit the game, to the point where you could actually stack up clips from the original game next to the remake, and it felt right. Where with Resident Evil 3, it is interesting. They seem to have taken a lot more liberties overall with the basic flow and design of the game, and like what you're doing and where you're going. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. So I agree that Resident Evil 2 was definitely a lot more recognizable for players of the original than Resident Evil 3 was. It seems that Capcom has adopted 3 different ways to remake a game here. So the first would be how they remade the first game on GameCube, where they stuck very closely to the original framework and made improvements, but they didn't change all that much. Whereas with Resident Evil 2, they kept quite a bit of the core design, but they redesigned other parts in places where it made sense, like making the sewers more expansive. And the laboratory was completely different, but there were still a few rooms in there where you can kind of tell that they had pulled the design from the original. But with Resident Evil 3, what's surprising is that I don't think there is a single room in the game. Well, maybe that's not true. I mean, I would say maybe there are a handful of rooms in the game that are lifted to some extent from the original game. And honestly, I feel like I could count them with one hand. It's really interesting how they eschewed all of the design of the original game and just went with whatever they did with the remake. Funny enough, I think the few rooms that do make it from the original RE3 are all in the RPD, which is kind of cheating if you think about it. So, I mean, it kind of beckons the question, is this really a remake, or should we call it a reimagining? I mean, I'm inclined to call it the latter. I think a remake doesn't quite accurately describe what we're seeing with this game. I mean, I feel like half of the original game is missing and replaced with other content.
I mean, arguably that's not a bad thing, since it basically means that this is an original game. It's just it is curious to sort of, you're channeling Resident Evil 3, but you're delivering something that's very, very different and kind of only really related in spirit. And that's also true, I don't want to spoil much here, but the way Nemesis works in this is also rather different, and it's different from Mr. X as well in Resident Evil 2. So he is a little bit more of a cinematic set piece kind of experience now.
Yeah, I was actually quite disappointed because Nemesis doesn't have any sense of unpredictability that he was known for in the original game. And it's hilarious because, like you mentioned, it's different from how Mr. X was implemented in RE2. In the 1998 Resident Evil 2, Mr. X was his appearances were fixed. They always happened at the same time in the same room. So he wasn't a true stalker in that sense. But when they remade Resident Evil 2, Mr. X, could go from room to room, and his appearances would be somewhat random, and you could generate specific scenes in one playthrough, but it might not happen in another playthrough if you're efficient with your routing. So Nemesis is definitely not like that in Resident Evil 3, which I think, I guess it depends on how you feel about stalker enemies to begin with. If you're one of those players who doesn't like it because it's unpredictable and it kind of, rackets, it kind of, raises the tension a lot, then maybe you might actually like how Nemesis has been implemented. But for me, I just feel like we don't get enough chances to do battle with Nemesis on our terms, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean. But what about compared to the original PS1 game?
I think one improvement over the original is that, I feel like I have a smaller than 50% chance I'm going to die just because I didn't mash the button correctly. In the original game, Nemesis has this move where if he grabs you and you're not, you don't press the buttons quickly enough, then he'll just, one-hit KO you right there. And that, yeah, for the most part, I feel like it has to happen in this game if you're either low on health or you've set yourself up for that kind of thing. So I would say that's an improvement, but Nemesis, he's no Jack Baker from RE7. He's no Mr. X. So it's a little disappointing that he's a little too predictable, especially after the first playthrough.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's right. I guess now, speaking of playthroughs, due to the nature of things, I have indeed played the game across all the different platforms, and this is where I think we should talk about the performance issues. So, true to the demo, the PS4 Pro version is indeed on top. So the game targets 60 frames per second across all platforms. If you're playing on the Pro, you get that pretty much most of the time. It is not perfect. There's definitely moments where it dips below, but I feel like it's very comparable to what we saw with Resident Evil 2, where the overall level of performance is high enough, it's consistent enough that you can call this a full 60 frames per second game. And in that sense, I do think that of all the console versions, this is the one that does play the best. And so it's a success there. I was a little bit surprised that, there are some areas where it does dip a little further than you might expect, including the police station itself. When you revisit it, doesn't run quite as well as it did in Resident Evil 2, but, it's a different scenario, I suppose, but still. The real takeaway here is that fundamentally, the performance is basically the same as what we saw in the demo. If there is any difference, it's very, very subtle, but that's perfectly fine in the case of PS4 Pro, because aside from those moments like we just saw where there are some dips, again, it's mostly very, very stable. So it plays great on PS4 Pro, and I think that's actually where you played it first as well, right?
Yeah, I got a PS4 copy, so it runs actually pretty well for the most part. I feel like I noticed some slowdown in certain parts, especially the more action-oriented sequences, but I mean, it's not a big deal, and they're all very, very temporary.
Right. So I guess the disappointing thing is like the demo, the Xbox One X version, by targeting native 4K resolution, even with checkerboarding of some sort, it does not maintain 60 FPS. So in that sense, it is noticeably less stable than Resident Evil 2 last year, which did run at a lower resolution similar to PS4 Pro on the X. So by targeting this high resolution, that pretty much means that the game is always under 60 FPS during just about every gameplay sequence. It pretty much runs at about 50 frames per second on average, I'd say. Sometimes you'll get dips as low as nearly 30, like in this scene here where I explode a barrel right next to Nemesis there. You can see it drops to 32 FPS momentarily. A big drop there on the frame rate graph. So, and this is kind of consistent throughout my entire playthrough on Xbox One X, and it's especially bad in the cutscenes. So, the thing is, though, is I feel like there's two ways to approach this to fix this in a potential patch. One, offer players the option to cap the frame rate at 30 FPS. It would at least be a stable 30, which I think would feel better overall. Or offer something to reduce the resolution back to, say, Resident Evil 2 levels, so you could at least conceivably hit that level of performance. So I actually asked Capcom about this, and was basically told that Capcom is definitely aware of the fan feedback with regards to Xbox performance, so they may look into providing a solution sometime after launch. So hopefully there is some hope on the horizon for Xbox owners. I mean, it's still perfectly playable. It's just very, very unstable. And that's, disappointing, I think.
Yeah, that sounds really unfortunate because I really liked Resident Evil 2 on the Xbox One X. I thought it was the best way to play it last time around, but it sounds like it's the worst this time around. So I'm hoping that Capcom can fix that at some point.
Well, I guess saying the worst isn't really accurate, honestly. And that's where we come to the base consoles. So looking at both of these, they both offer performance remarkably similar to Xbox One X, though obviously at a lower resolution, but I think they both tend to run slower overall, especially the base Xbox One. The frame rate often can drop down to near 30 FPS in some scenes, especially when a lot of effects are going on, so it's really kind of suboptimal, I think, in comparison. But it's also not entirely surprising, as this was in fact the case with Resident Evil 2 as well, though I think both of them do perform a little worse overall. It's just a case of the game running with a completely uncapped frame rate, so you're kind of always between 30 and 60 FPS, but very rarely actually holding at 60. And this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, as I really don't like such variability in the frame rate. It just doesn't feel smooth as it should. So obviously there were several options on the Xbox side for improving performance, but I think here on the base consoles, the best thing they could do is offer an optional frame rate cap. So if you locked it at 30 FPS, you would end up with a very stable, consistent level of performance, even if the maximum frame rate is lower. But obviously preferences vary, and some people won't have any issues with this uncapped frame rate. So yeah, that's kind of the situation there in terms of frame rate. It's pretty much just like the demo, which means if you have a choice of console, I would definitely recommend PS4 Pro above all. Unless of course you want to play on PC, in which case that will depend on your hardware. As for the game itself, well, it's obviously a shorter, more linear game. I don't feel it lives up to Resident Evil 2 Remake, but it still technically plays well and it looks beautiful, so it's a fun action game with some cool set-piece moments, but it doesn't quite go as far as I would have hoped. But what are your thoughts on this, Alex?
I've actually beaten it like 6 or 7 times already, so I do have to preface that this game is quite short by a lot of metrics, not just an experienced Resident Evil player's metrics. I would imagine that it won't take the average player all that long to beat the game. And for better or worse, a lot of the variability that was found in the original game is completely missing. So I have very mixed feelings about that. But I imagine it's the kind of Resident Evil game where you turn your brain off and you focus just on, shooting zombies and, running through the city. It's not like... It doesn't have the same sense of like mystery that Resident Evil 2 is very well known for, and the cutscenes aren't nearly as dramatic in general. But yeah, I would argue Resident Evil 2 is probably the better game, which isn't saying much because that was one of the top games in the series, even with the original version. So I wasn't expecting RE3 to really top that, but I did expect them to kind of modernize the game in a lot of ways, which they've done, to be fair, by using a lot of the gameplay that was introduced with RE2. But I feel like they didn't bother, going back to the specific features that made the original RE3 so unique, like the live selections and the variations in the paths that you could take throughout the game and the multiple cutscenes. I feel like with all that missing, some of the essence of Resident Evil 3 is just gone, and I'm very, I guess, ambivalent. I'm ambivalent about it. My image of remaking Resident Evil 3 would be to take what that game was and modernize it and scale it up, not take away what made that game special and crab it into the framework of another Resident Evil game. So I think when people play the game, they'll probably notice similarities to other RE games, but that are not the original RE3. And I'm not going to talk about it here because that would be spoiling it to some extent. But I'm curious to see if people aren't reminded of certain other Resident Evil games that have come out over the years when playing Resident Evil 3.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a good way to look at it overall. It's a solid action game that plays like some other Resident Evil games, but it lacks a lot of what made Resident Evil 3 specifically special. It's also rather smaller in scope and just doesn't feel quite as ambitious as the previous game. Even still, I did have a good time playing it, specifically on Ps4 Pro, as the other console versions definitely aren't quite where I'd like them to be. But I think that's going to do it for now, so thanks for joining me, Alex.
Anytime.
And if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring that notification bell for instant updates, and of course, come find us over on Twitter. And until next time...
What do you mean, who is this? It's Chris. Why won't you believe me?